So earlier this week, I was invited to participate in an interfaith gathering at Trinity College at the University of Toronto. And there, the Archbishop Linda Nichols, former Anglican Primate of Canada, received an honorary degree, as did Bishop Michael Curry, the former presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church of the United States. Bishop Curry is best known as the one who officiated at the wedding of the Prince. So it was really a wonderful gathering, and the theme of the keynote addresses was sustaining hope and seeking justice in challenging times. And I was fortunate to be the first of 6 responders to talk about hope and justice in challenging times. And I began by saying that these last 2 years seems like hope and justice is all I'm ever talking about, all I'm ever thinking about, writing about, praying about, preaching about, and advocating for. And all the speakers, of all their different backgrounds, there was a Buddhist monk speaking, there was an Indigenous Canadian bishop, there was an LGBTQ plus bishop of the Lutheran Church. Everyone spoke. There was a Jesuit priest as well. Everyone spoke from their own lived experience about justice and injustice, about hope and the lack of hope. And I felt like we were really speaking the same language. And I felt like family in that room where I was the only Jew in the room. And then it turned to the Q&A. And a minister whom I will not name, someone I did not know before, kicked off the Q&A by saying, "I have a question for the rabbi." And that was my cue to brace myself for what was to come. And unfortunately, what came was a question about how he could express his anti-Israel sentiments without being accused of being an anti-Semite. And of course, the first thing I said in my response was I welcomed him to a fuller conversation, and I hope he will take me up on it. And I answered as you would have expected, in a way that was polite and encouraging and also discerning. After the Q&A, and when we turned to coffee and dessert, a number of the religious leaders in the room approached me one by one and asked, what can they do? What can their congregations do? And I could tell that they were trying to restore something that had been broken, where for a moment I felt like family in that room, and then with just one question, I was made to feel like an other. And so they were trying to restore those bonds which bind us together. Others told me that they were planning a trip to Israel and to Palestine, that they were bringing their congregants to bear witness to all kinds of hardships throughout the land, and also to show support and concern. And I met another minister who teaches at U of T, who spoke almost through tears about how much he loves the Hebrew Bible, how much he loves the Hebrew language. And I could tell that this was also his way of trying to restore something that had been broken. And so I appreciated that, that time over coffee and dessert as a kind of restoration. All of these themes about how fragile are the familial ties among peoples of faith comes through loud and clear in our Torah and Haftarah. There is so much tension in every verse as brothers turn to others. In the Hebrew language, there is a pun. There is the word bachor, and there is the word bachor. Bachor, spelled with a chaf, refers to the firstborn child. Bachor with a chet refers to one who is chosen. And then there is a third word by Hebrew wordplay, which is bracha, which shares the same 3 core letters but are in another order. And bracha, of course, means blessing. So all 3 of these concepts, the firstborn, the chosen or favored one, and a blessing, these are all mashed up in our Torah, and it only continues in our Haftarah. It was the custom in the ancient world, and still today for many families of the earth, that the firstborn son or daughter is in a favorable position, both responsible and privileged. These come to the eldest, to the firstborn. However, the Hebrew Bible is, as we spoke about in our Torah study this morning, countercultural, filled with examples of how this pattern is challenged and inverted. More often than not, in the Tanakh, it is the younger child or a younger child who is chosen to rule over the older. The most dramatic example, Jacob and Esau, twins who in their mother's womb wrestle over who would be the firstborn, and Jacob clings to the heel of his brother at birth, and later in life he clings to the birthright, he clings to his father's blessing, which was intended for Esau, the firstborn. And we can empathize with Esau when he comes forward back from the field, and he breaks down and says to his father, Barcheni gam ani avi. Bless me too, my father. You must have more than one blessing. And we can hear this plea not only from the human child to the human father, but from the human child to the divine parent, saying, "Oh God, bless me too. You must have more than just one blessing. It cannot be that just one people is blessed." Rabbi Soloveitchik, who is still the most influential voice in the modern Orthodox world, teaches the following: all humankind, whatever color or creed, is created in the image of God and is possessed of an inherent human dignity and worthiness. Humankind's singularity is derived from the breath of God, where it is written in Genesis 2 that God breathed life into the human being. And so God's providential concern embraces all of humanity. That is to say, the Jewish people and the people of Israel have no monopoly on God or God's blessing. However, we do have a unique relationship with God, and this should not be misunderstood as a claim to superiority. It is not. The Bible never hesitates to chronicle and condemn the Jewish people's shortcomings and outright failures. Again and again, God's disappointment and frustration with this Am Segula is recorded time and time again. But even when the covenant is threatened, neither God nor the Jewish people ever calls it quits. There is that dangerous slogan, the chosen people. It's enough to make us squirm in our seats. This title has too often made us the target of jealousy and hatred. And so most Jews, like the Shalom Aleichem character in Fiddler on the Roof, we also turn to God and say, couldn't you choose someone else once in a while? This concept of chosenness, which is more often spoken about by non-Jews than it is about Jews, is problematic for everyone. If we are a people devoted to equality and justice for all people, by definition, the words chosen make us uneasy. Our sages fill pages and pages trying to clarify this idea, because this inheritance of chosenness made them uneasy too. Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan founded the Reconstructionist movement on the rejection of chosenness. But for all the other streams of Judaism, including our own Reform Judaism, chosenness has always remained a core belief. Just moments ago, when people came to bless the Torah, they say, Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, that you have singled us out somehow from the other peoples. Always controversial, often misunderstood, but nevertheless, this is a core belief. The 12th century giant Maimonides asks, why did God choose to reveal Torah to just one people at one particular time, rather than to all peoples at all times? And the only answer he can offer is because God willed it. That is Maimonides' way of saying, I have no idea. And that was hard for him to admit, because Maimonides was a genius. The reason for Jewish particularism is still a mystery, and the great philosopher was not afraid to admit it. Why it is so, why we have been singled out with a special kind of mission for all the world, is a mystery. But how does it come to be so is clear. It is nothing about superiority or worth or favoritism. It has everything to do instead with responsibility. Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, v'natan lanu et Torato. Everything hinges on that syllable v'natan lanu, and you have chosen us from among all the peoples by giving us your Torah. Through the giving of Torah. But no matter how you translate it, with this bracha we affirm that our own bechorah, our own uniqueness, is entirely defined. It is in every way determined by our response to Torah. For bringing Torah to the world, sharing it, living it, fulfilling it as best we can. Rabbi Morris Joseph, at the turn of the 19th century, wrote this about chosenness. We therefore affirm, not that we are better, but that we ought to be better. It is this striving, this constant aspiration towards holiness that is the best descriptor of our chosenness. Because we have in our possession the how-to book, the manual, V'natan lanu et Torato, we are able to strive. We are to give shape to the world by living according to Torah's wisdom and by sharing it with all humanity. Through our words, through our actions, we serve as a dugma, as an example of how to walk in God's ways. Call us a pilot project or a centuries-long demonstration for the world to see how productive and how rewarding a life of Torah can be. That is our sacred service. Our sages ask, why did God speak to Moses out of a thorn bush? Why a lowly thorn bush? And Rabbi Yochanan offers an answer in the form of a simile, saying, because just as a thorn bush grows roses and thorns, so are there both righteous and wicked among the Jewish people. And yet, just as one protects a garden by planting a fence of thorn bushes around it, of planting rose bushes around it, so has God planted the Jewish people as a protective fence for the world. That is to say, the Jewish people as a whole, living by Torah, is intended to set moral boundaries for humanity. By carrying out the wisdom of Torah, we keep God's world from growing wild and without limits. The Reverend Edward H. Flannery of the National Conference of Catholic Bishops writes this: it was Judaism that brought the concept of a God-given universal moral law into the world. And willingly or not, the Jew carries the burden of God in history, and for this, he has never been forgiven. Because no one likes to be fenced in. God says through the prophet Isaiah, "You are my witnesses." Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai teaches that only when we are witnesses of God is God God, if one would dare to say such a thing. And if you are not my witnesses, God says, then it is as if, it is ki'ilu, it is as if I am not God at all. This bold, chutzpahdik teaching on the part of our rabbis comes to show that God is eternal, but nevertheless dependent on us who say the Shema and testify to God's oneness. God needs us and those who join us to point and proclaim this is God. And it may sound heretical to say that God is dependent or God needs, but Jewish tradition offers this as evidence that God wants human partners in the ongoing work of creation. This partnership, this covenant, may have begun with the Jewish people, but it is designed to radiate out to include all of humanity. Now, I am a middle child, and my father lovingly calls me Yael ha'emtza'it, Yael, the one in the middle. Only now that I have children of my own have I come to understand why parents seem to have a unique relationship with their firstborn child. It's not because that child is more lovable or more brilliant, but simply because that child made the parents into parents. Before that child was born, that parent was not a mother or a father. So too with God and the Jewish people. Until Abraham and Sarah came along to recognize Adonai Echad, this is the one and only God, it was as if God were not yet God. Of course, God always existed, but it was not until the birth of the Jewish people, so to speak, that God's status changed to that of Avinu, parent of humanity. Only then was a relationship established. Only then was God spared from eternal loneliness. As we carry the story forward of Jacob and Esau, both brothers and others, there is another very fraught scene of reunion. Years later, they meet up again, and they barely know how to look one another in the eye. And so instead, they embrace and they weep on one another's necks. This way, they don't have to look one another in the eye. And Jacob, who has matured only somewhat, says to his other brother, Esav, Kachna et birchati, please, I beg of you, accept my blessing. Where years before he struggled that blessing out of his brother's hand, now Jacob, our patriarch, has found the maturity and the way to offer blessing, to share blessing, to imbue blessing. He became, maybe for just a moment, a fulfillment of God's charge to Abraham, V'yeh bracha, you shall be a blessing. More important than receiving a blessing, even more important than giving a blessing, is to be a blessing. So good people, at this time of tension and strife among brothers and others, when there is tension among the peoples of the earth, when we are often misunderstood, when we also often misstep ourselves, let us find our way to both give and receive blessing, and most of all, let us do our utmost to be a blessing. Amen.